Astrology and astrotheology have to be two of my favorite subjects to research. And I think the reason why, although I may be opposed to certain beliefs or dogmatic views, astrology has proven itself to be a very beneficial thing to not only ancients but to modern man. And it's something that we can actually observe, and this is what makes it so interesting to me. All the religions out there that are based on these old ideas, and they've tried to take these cosmic principles and apply them to something that we can understand, the human life. And all the way through the ancient cultures, you can trace it, basically all of it, back to the precession, the Great Year. For those who aren't aware, the Great Year is a cycle that is every 72 years we move 1 degree in the sky. So therefore, every 25,920 years, the Earth goes through these precession where well, let's just call it the Great Year. You can do your research. A lot of you will probably know what I'm talking about already. So within that Great Year, we have these cycles of 72 years. And within those cycles of 72 years, there's also a 2160-year cycle. That's 12 times the 72, which is correlating to the zodiac. And if you multiply that by 12 again, you get the Great Year. So that 12 times the 12 is 144. So in there you have the 72, the 144. And of course, if you take 25,920 and reduce it, it comes to 9 again. So we start to see how these ancient correlations of numbers tied into astronomical events. So the thing is, this is why it's so interesting to me, because you can observe it, you can see it, and these cycles obviously have some sort of an effect on the human psyche. The idea that within 1 year, the solar cycles affect us with so many different moods and ideas. The whole idea of archetypes. Archetypes are forms set up in a formless state because they're not readily observable. You can't put your finger on it, and this is why we created and use archetypes to describe certain stories. And basically, the Bible is one big symbol, one big long archetypal story, which includes many astronomical and astrological factors, which are broken down and anthropomorphized and put into a human form. And this is what makes it so fascinating to me. In other words, the truth is sometimes stranger than fiction. It would be amazing to believe that, let's say, the Bible written was literal, but it's even more amazing to think that this information has been encoded for so long, and modern man now is finally able to decode this through science. So science, rather than being an opposing view to belief systems or astrology or astrotheology, you have it tending to confirm many of the suspicions. And there are very few people who will dispute the fact that during a full moon there is more crime, or that people act strange. And this is just one that we can observe because we see the full moon and we know the cycle. The crime rates go up. There are many different events like this, and the sun affects us in many different ways as well. We have solar events and sunspot cycles which affect tree rings and affect even the fur on a rabbit. I can't remember exactly what happens to the fur, but these solar events, which may seem minimal when observed, actually have a major impact and effect on us. So the yearly cycles, if you start out with the daily cycle, you wake up, you go to sleep, you have many different feelings and emotional states throughout the day, but they tend to remain consistent to an extent. You have the morning feelings and the evening feelings. Well, we also have the dark winter of man. The winter is man's nighttime, and that is symbolic in the year itself. So then we have to figure out, what about the great year? What about the 2160 or the 72-year cycles, and how do those affect us? And going back through history, you start to see these patterns of events that happened during certain phases. And when you look at how we're moving into the age of Aquarius from the age of Pisces, you can trace, Pisces back to so many different things. The bishops and the Pope's hat are based on the fish, which was taken from Pisces. And you hear people talk about the age of Aquarius as if we're moving into it right now. The reason why there's so much debate on whether we're in it or we're moving into it is because on the cyclical wheel, it tends to overlap. I guess you'd have to look into it yourself, but on the celestial wheel of the constellations, it tends to overlap into Pisces, so people believe, well, maybe we're in the very early stages of it right now. But if you look back through history of the wars that have happened and the different events, it starts to take shape, and we start to see these positive and negative times, and that's not in a good and bad way. The positive and negative are just the balance that we need. We're starting to find out, I was listening to Manly Hall earlier, and he was talking about positive and negative people. Not in a good and bad way, but how we need that balance. And it's something I hadn't really considered, But not only that, we have not only the positive and negative people, and we're not talking about positivity and being a positive person or positive thinking. This is much deeper than that, and it's not a good or bad thing. But we have balance. But within that, each individual born into a particular star sign is going to have a particular different path, different strengths and weaknesses. And I think the problem comes with trying to determine who's trying to make a buck off of astrology and who's actually doing the homework. And it seems that if there's anything that the ancients had, if there's any great wisdom that the ancients had that we can learn today, it would be through that precession and those, astrological knowings. I was speaking earlier about Helios in a previous video, the god of sun. He had a shield that reflects the sun, and how we don't actually see the direct light of God or of the sun, but rather it's a reflection. And all of these symbols tie in to understand why we worship the things we do. People look back on gold. Gold is a good example. If you look at the way that we've revered gold through history, one might be quick to think that it's merely because it's valuable. But the ancients didn't know anything about value. It was a metal that was usable, and it was a metal that could be used to trade. But more important than that, it resembled the sun. And the sun was the god. So gold, as well as halos, crowns, rosettes, all of those are symbols of the sun. And we've carried those on into modern traditions and modern religions, and it's funny to see that the people don't even realize it. All of this comes from astrological cycles. Samson, when you hear the story of Samson, how he cut his hair, and he lost his, strength because he cut his hair. The truth behind that is Samson is the sun. If the word Samson doesn't say it right there, but Samson is the sun, and the cutting of the hair is symbolic of the winter, and how during the winter the rays are cut down, the sun is weaker, and so by cutting the hair or cutting the sun's rays, it made him weaker. And I don't really know how much more clear than that could be. I mean, there's much symbolism and archetype, many things that we can take many different ways, but Samson is the sun. So many of the prophecies of history were based on time cycles, okay? And one of the greatest, most interesting, theories, I guess, that I've heard was, people like Nostradamus and prophets, many of the prophets of past, weren't able to, in other words, there's no real answer to how they can predict these things or know or have any validity in them unless they were going by time cycles. And I think that if we researched this deeper, if we were able to finally break it down and figure out which cycles we're in, then we can live a better life. And I think that's what a lot of people are doing right now. You hear people talk about, how we're in the house of Mars and all these different things about how we're having a conjunction with Venus and Mars, and nobody really seems to know what that really means. And I'm not saying that nobody does. I mean that most people don't know what that means. You'll look it up and somebody will say, oh, Mars is here today, so people's moods are going to be affected this way, or this is a good or bad time for people. I don't think it's that simple. I think it's more complex in the sense that when a particular planet is in a particular place, when a particular conjunction or astrological event takes place, it sends, symbolically, it sends out a signal, and each person is going to interpret that signal differently. Each person's tuned to a different frequency, and they're going to receive a different signal. So, while this may mean good luck for one person, it may be bad luck for another person. And this is where it breaks down into personal cycles and personal, birth signs, and that's where it starts to get confusing. Because if there was one way to just say, this is where the planets are, this is how people are going to feel today, that would be great. But we know there are no days where everybody's happy or everybody's sad. So it's up to the individual to figure out exactly how their own sign correlates. And I'm a Sagittarius for what it's worth. I don't. I pretty much fit the Sagittarian profile, but I don't know what to make of it. And there's nobody that can really teach, I don't think, an individual about. You can teach people about times. You can teach people about their particular signs and, supposedly the type of person they are. But in the end, each individual has to seek out their own truth. So with all the confusion out there and all the things that we're not sure if might be true or things we can't prove, astrology is one thing that holds weight for thousands and thousands of years. And you can be assured that our ancestors had plenty of time to spend looking up at the stars and documenting these things. But there are some questions that remain to be answered, such as, how were they aware of the great year? How could the ancients be aware of a 26,000 year cycle? And these are questions we might never answer. Perhaps they were given the knowledge, perhaps they were able to pull it out of the air, by meditation or other means. They knew the planets, they understood the planets and the masses and where they were located. How? How did the ancients know where the planets were? Well, if we're truly all connected to the universal mind, then you could think one may be able to connect to that and draw out a map of the solar system. But I think it's a little more complex than that. Even in ancient times, we had good maps of the entire world, long before flat earthers even finally agreed that the earth was round. So there were sects and groups in history that understood these things, and I get the feeling that for the most part they were dismissed because people wanted simple answers. People want to be able to open up a book and have it tell them what God wants from them, what they're supposed to do, and how to live their life. And if a person has to go deep into astrology, it's it could be daunting. But honestly, if there was ever a map laid out for us to understand ourselves, it's very difficult to find. But the one thing I think that is right out there in front of us, there's two things. There's three things that I see as being I guess you might call them the Trinity. You have mathematics, then you have sacred geometry, and then you have astrology. And between those three, There's not a lot we can't figure out about ourselves. It's like having all the pieces to the puzzle, but just not being able to see the picture to arrange it. And in time, if we're persistent, we might be able to make something of it. I mean, for thousands of years, we've worked towards understanding ourselves through the stars. And I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. So namaste, everybody. Have a great evening. And remember that sun up there is, the first, the first God, if you will. So let there be light.